We actually took a break because, as you saw at the end of the previous recording, that Jared had to leave. So if you haven't watched our discussion with Jared on this topic, please do go ahead. But now it's John and I, and so we want to go back to the discussion we had about how religion emerges, how about the conversions, how conversions happen, and about how faith is maintained or religion is maintained. So yeah, we will probably try to cover a number of topics here. So, but I would like to start with just kind of a few words about deep time. And this is a concept that when most adults are aware of what deep time means. It's and it's a little bit in contrast to like literalist interpretations of scripture. Human history is part of history of the universe. Universe had a beginning. It started about 14 billion years ago with the so-called Big Bang. And the matter that was created in the course of the Big Bang eventually formed into galaxies, stars, and planets. And so the age of our solar system and planet Earth is about 4.5 billion years. And life on Earth is nearly as old as the Earth itself. And so mammals, our ancestors, mammals evolved from reptiles about 250 million years ago. That's why sometimes they talk about that, humans have this reptile brain, or part of our brain that is the most primitive part. And then primates, or monkeys, diverged from other mammals about 85 million years ago. And our ape line, so humans are also part of the primate line, and the ape line evolved from our last common ancestor about 19 million years ago. And so the hominin line then branched into two about 5.5 to 7 million years ago, with one line leading to the chimpanzees and bonobos and the other leading to us. So modern humans actually share 99% of our genes with living chimpanzees. So and in our line, then from 5 million years ago, scientists have discovered a number of different types of hominins that preceded Homo sapiens, or the modern human. And then the scientific consensus is that Homo sapiens emerged about 200,000 years ago. And so I will remark that, some religious people dismiss evolution because they see stark differences between species. But we must bear in mind that the time it took for the evolutionary steps to come about is incomprehensible, like I just explained. Like, for example, the United States has been around for 250 years. The American continent was rediscovered by Europeans 500 years ago. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. But as we just discussed, we can trace life and evolution of humans back millions and tens of millions of years ago, and so that's why it's important to mention.
I think one of the interesting things is to just rehearse quickly some of the evidence for the evolution of humans from other primates. And I think a lot of, some say, members of, fundamentalist religions don't appreciate the extensiveness of the evidence. And a lot of them are super interesting once you realize, like, these types of, some of the interesting evidences are atavisms, and basically different features of our biology or physiology that don't really have a purpose, or it's not a clear purpose, and but that do have a purpose in our in close cousin organisms. So goosebumps are one of these things where, like, why do we get goosebumps? They don't really make sense, except for if you're trying to fluff up your hair, either for warmth or for, to scare away, a potential predator or things like that. Your ear wiggling muscles, like, we don't really, as humans, we have no need for being able to wiggle our ears, but this is something that other primates do. We have remnants of a third eyelid, including some non-functional muscles. So the plica semiluminaris is a remnant of the nictitating membrane. So eyelids that can go across your eye in a different direction. We have the palmar grasp reflex, the ability of some humans to grab on super tightly. That's not in all humans, but that's something that a primate infant needs to be able to do. It needs to be able to grasp onto its mother or things like that as it's being mobile. And we have, some humans have true tails. Humans have a point on their ear. So if you look, some humans have a point on their ear. It's referred to as Darwin's tubercle. And it's a little point, and that point it corresponds to the point on a primate's ear, when you had a sort of a different ear shape. And all of these, so those are some of the physical characteristics. And then you also have, great apes have 48 chromosomes. We have 46, and we can see the chromosome. So it's like, I think it's chromosome 2 that is the result of a fusion event. And when you look at the sequences of that chromosome, the part where it's been fused, it has the remnants of the ends of other chromosomes. So you can see the relic of the fusion event. It's very clear, if you understand kind of the genetic sequences, it's very clear and obvious that it was the result of a fusion event. And so, and then you can track the loss of genes, like the ability to synthesize vitamin C through those lineages and just things like that. So there's just a massive amount of evidence that strongly suggests this common ancestry and common origin with other primates among humans.
Yes.
And it doesn't make much sense. It doesn't have much purpose or function on its own. It's like, why do we need a point in our ear? Why do we need, again, goosebumps or these things as humans? They don't make a lot of sense as human, but they do make a lot of sense as primates.
Sure, but I think that I think now is actually a very good time to discuss the concept of Occam's razor, because a religious person or a literalist scripture believer might say, but John, this is just how God created everyone, that there are resemblances. This is all God's big design. He created everything, in 6 days, and we are sort of similar to other creatures. But that doesn't mean that there was this biological evolution, that one came from another. And I think that we could at this point discuss this term Occam's razor, because from my personal history, when I became familiar with the concept of Occam's razor, then I became more open to looking at other perspectives related to how things work in the world, in the universe, and what causes what, and stuff like that. So do you want to take a jab at explaining Occam's razor? Oh, I can't hear you. I think your microphone is down.
Sorry, I was muted. Sure. Yeah, Occam's razor is the idea that if there are competing models to explain something, that typically the model with the fewest number of assumptions to explain the phenomenon is the better explanation. And so what are some, trying to think of good examples to talk about. So yeah, let me.
Yeah, I would probably say anything. This is also, I think, like how forensic detectives would work, is like you look at the evidence and like you look at the totality of evidence, and then you think, well, what is the most plausible scenario of what took place, right? And I think that's basically what Occam's razor is that whenever you have a group of evidence, or like a collection of evidences, then what is most likely, what is the simplest way to understand, to explain what has happened, what has taken place.
Yeah. So and an example might be, and I'm probably going to pick a poor example, but well, let's just go with the evolution one since we're thinking about this. So the creationist framework has to assert that God is just maybe picking and choosing features to then layer into the organisms that he creates, or he or she creates. But then what the loss, or the reason that becomes an issue is, so you can say that, you can say, well, yeah, God just uses, let's say he has a grab bag of parts. And so, well, of course, organisms maybe that are kind of similar, he's just using similar parts of the grab bag. But those are you can just continue to add assumptions as much as you want, but it prevents you from making good predictions about what the world should look like in the future. So an example might be is that so we diverged evolutionarily from fish. So there's a separate line of when scales developed on fish. And so, because that happened way after the split of a common ancestor based on our evolutionary theory, we can hypothesize and predict that we will not find mammals that also produce true scales. Whereas with a model, with a creationist model, there's nothing that really prevents God, let's say, to a first approximation, there's no reason why God wouldn't make a primate that also produces scales on some part of its body, right? Like that sounds like a cool feature, maybe a value add. Like why don't we see that? And so by having, but the having fewer assumptions allows you typically to make better predictions, is kind of the idea. So if you just invoke ad hoc assumptions, those ad hoc assumptions don't allow you to make as strong of predictions.
Yeah, so absolutely.
That's my way I don't know if stumble through that.
No, that's fine. I mean, or another one that maybe hits close to home to LDS people, and I don't mean to be offensive, and I'm not really sure if it's a good example of Occam's razor, but I'll say it anyways, and then John, you can critique me. In 2015, the LDS Church came out with a policy that basically said that if you're a child, you are not allowed to, if you're a child and your parents are a gay couple, then homosexual couple, then you cannot be baptized or advance in the priesthood, or you can't have these privileges. And there were some other things, and it was a sort of a controversial controversial top policy. And in order to protect and get the adherence to the policy, the church leaders really pushed the narrative that it was received, by revelation from God, this policy. And then, but the reaction to the policy was that a lot of members, disapproved, and many, voted with their feet and, left their church or were very vocal in opposition to the policy. And then only 3 years later, the church reversed the policy. And again, I think this time they also did comment that it was by revelation that it was reversed, but they didn't want to comment too much, and it wasn't too public of an issue. But so they said that God gave a new revelation that 3 years later that people that were used to that in 2015 they were considered the homosexuals were considered apostates, and the children were not allowed to be baptized. Now it was reversed, and now they were allowed to be baptized, and the homosexual couples were no longer considered apostates. So you could say that in order to say that this was a revelation from God, you have to postulate that the church is led by revelation. It's led by prophets, and they talk to God, and they all sorts of things, which are basically dogmatically motivated. But then the other option would be to say this was just a simple example of a human policy, and the reaction to the negative reception and all the criticism that the church received was also a human reaction, an institutional reaction to it. There's no need for God or revelations or specific spiritual experiences that came to the leaders of the church. So that's just kind of another example of simplify or make what happened more consistent with the natural world, and the organizational dynamics that we are aware of. There's no need for any supernatural explanation to this this policy and reversal of policy. So
we often see policy making and reversal of policy making in organizations that aren't proclaiming to communicate with an omniscient being. And so that's where you can say, well, we can explain this without that. I would just point out, I guess, that one of the reasons that it's difficult, you can almost never disprove the God hypothesis. So that is almost always a valid way to interpret it, is because because you're dealing with another agent, and he has presumably access to more information than we do. So we don't ever hit a point where we can say, hey, we understand everything about this situation. And as a result, that's a very sticky hypothesis. It doesn't, it's very difficult to disconfirm it and say this absolutely isn't, can't be used to explain it, because because of those features of that model, is that he's omniscient and he has more information than we have. And as a result, it's, well, what piece of information don't we have? And we can imagine all kinds of different pieces of information that wouldn't necessarily violate the idea that he's eternal and unchanging in his character. And that's what makes it so, I would say, so, such a sort of sticky or interesting hypothesis, and why it's very difficult to falsify that.
I agree somewhat, but I think also you have to bear in mind that this reversal came 3 years after the original policy, which were both revelations. And so the omniscience of God is definitely, put under question thereby, because either, God made a huge blunder, or, the other option is that God is so beholden to human reactions to his policies that it becomes a question of, what is his role, at all, if, he changes his minds to any negative reaction that people have. So,
Yeah, and that's valid pushback and criticism. It's just like I say, it's sort of the unknown unknowns that are end up being allow that model to be redeemed, is because, and that's why people often are able to maintain faith in models that otherwise they might discard, is if there's some element of or if there's enough unknown elements that make it very difficult. When a system is very well defined, it makes it much easier to discard certain hypotheses, and so that's one, where that's why certain fundamentalist conceptions of religion you can actually sort of kind of disprove more more robustly.
Yeah. But anyway, so the point about Occam's razor is that whenever you see things or claims in the world that basically depend on some special scenarios or some special prerequisites, then you can always ask, is there a simpler way to explain this, and less dependent on unfalsifiable, dimensions or something?
Yeah, I'm thinking, an example that I think often gets used, especially in debates about God, is the idea, or would be an example like you hear something crashing in your house, something fell off a shelf, and you have a cat that lives in your house, let's say, and the cat is prone maybe to jumping on furniture and things like that. Well, you don't know for sure because maybe you don't have any evidence, but it could have been that, for example, an alien came down in a spaceship, flew through the window, knocked those things off of the shelf, and that's what was responsible for that. Like, that's a possibility, like you can't necessarily discount that. But then but in order to do that, you sort of needed to invoke a special or a more strained assumption. In this case, it's the assumption, that is more difficult to prove. And that's the assumption of the alien, and that the alien took an interest in your house, and and the alien flew through the window and decided to knock something off the shelf. Like, its flying systems were so poor that it needed to do that, or it had some other function for doing that. Anyway, it raises a whole sequence of assumptions as soon as you say, well, maybe it was an alien that did it, versus saying, well, it's probably the cat, right? Like, that's a very simple, you don't have to invoke the cat because you have the cat in order to do that. So that's maybe just a basic example too of kind of how that works.
Yeah, an alien or an angel or something, whatever, like that. Right. Some non-Earth entity. But so the reason we started with talking about evolution a little bit is that the reason I wanted to talk about this is because we can, or scientists have observed, religious-like behavior in animals, also in non-humans. So let's say, I will be quoting here from Wikipedia. Barbara King argues that while non-human primates are not religious, they do exhibit some traits that would have been necessary for the evolution of religion. These traits include high intelligence, a capacity for symbolic communication, a sense of social norms, a realization of self, of continuity. I think it should be continuity of self. Elephants demonstrate rituals around their deceased, which include long periods of silence and mourning at the point of death, and the process of returning to grave sites and caressing the remains. Some evidence suggests that many species grieve death and loss. So just an idea that that scientists these days, some scientists believe that we can observe at least prerequisites for later, um, religion, and some even say that they can observe rituals among groups of animals, and so these kinds of things that this can really this really does give more credence to the idea that uh, that religion and spirituality are an evolutionary process, or something that emerged out of evolution.
Yeah, and there's definitely some indicator of an evolution of religious thinking. And so, some of the earliest evidence we have for religious thought have to do with burial, and also, sort of deific types of figures. And so, and then we see, especially with the agricultural revolution, then we see much more robust and full-fledged religions emerging, in concert with the agricultural revolution, especially.
Absolutely. But I want to still point out some of the even earlier like prerequisites that were that needed to be there in order for religion to develop. And of course, the brain size had to increase, which happened throughout the course of evolution. And you can probably comment on what the theories are about why humans' brain size developed. And I think it's not only the brain size, it's also the respective sizes of the different parts of the brain, the neocortex and stuff like that. But
so a lot of evolutionary science is based on inferences to what is observed in the data, and not necessarily theories that have been demonstrated definitively. So I think that's something always important to remember in thinking about just evolutionary theory. A lot of the times it is kind of hypotheses of why this happened. We observe these things happening, and then we sort of retrofit explanations to them. And so so then the cortex is involved in a lot of these higher level processes. And if you some of those are like the ability to think about causation, so they call that etiology. Some of that is to think about other agents, and to think about there are other things with their own mental processes, and you have a way to model that. And these are all sort of higher order brain functionality. And the reward, or so the natural selection hypothesis would be that those organisms with the more ability to predict what other agents are going to do, the ability to socialize. So some of that is based on your ability to socialize, to empathize, and communicate symbolically. So the symbolic communication is all about being able to talk about things that aren't in your immediate presence. And so that allows, as soon as you can start thinking about causation and symbols, you can begin planning, and those types of activities can make it so that you can survive much more easily in terms of planning, both for, let's say, for agriculture, for hunting, and so agriculture is kind of a late invention, but particularly so protection from predators and
Sure.
going out on hunts and those types of planning, thinking, and especially like so the idea is if you're able to think like your prey is thinking, then that's a huge advantage because then you can make better predictions. So all of those are tied up then, but it's not necessarily understood. Humans have not been under high selective. Most parts of the human genome haven't been under high selective pressure in our existence, and so some of these things also might be just sort of accidental or co-opted, where it's like, well, this happens to be the course of mutation and change that has been happening, and so it can also be described as sort of an interesting accident. And I think the scientists are trying to clarify like which of those is actually the case, but those are the possibilities.
Sure. Okay. And some of these you mentioned too, but I will just quickly read from Wikipedia what it says about the relevant prerequisites for human religion. So the first one was increased brain size. The second is tool use. It says here, Lewis Wolpert argues that causal beliefs that emerge from tool use played a major role in the evolution of belief. The manufacture of complex tools requires creating a mental image of an object which does not exist naturally before actually making the artifact. The problem, or not the problem, but actually an interesting coincidence is that recent studies of other primates indicate that causality may not be a uniquely human trait, but as we discussed, neither are other things that are prerequisites for religion. So the second one was development of language. This is a big one because religion requires a system of symbolic communication, such as language, to be transmitted from one individual to another. So, yeah, I mean, if you don't have the language to explain religious concepts, you really can't make whatever you're thinking about, you cannot make it last, you cannot disperse it, so language was obviously a necessary prerequisite. And but when did language appear? Here's a quote: using statistical methods to estimate the time required. Johanna Nichols, a linguist at the University of California, Berkeley, argued that vocal languages must have begun diversifying in the human species at least 100,000 years ago. So there you go. That's one prerequisite. 100,000 years ago. Then the next one is morality and group living. Frantz de Waal and Barbara King both view human morality as having grown out of primate sociality. Although morality awareness may be a unique human trait, many social animals such as primates, dolphins, and whales have been known to exhibit pre-moral sentiments. According to Michael Shermer, the following characteristics are shared by humans and other social animals, particularly the great apes. So here's the list: attachment and bonding, cooperation and mutual aid, sympathy and empathy, direct and indirect reciprocity, altruism and reciprocal altruism, conflict resolution and peacemaking, deception and deception detection, community concern and caring about what others think about you, and awareness of and response of the social rules of the group. Comments? Do you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. I'm just thinking about, so when you talk about all of those different aspects, I think you begin to appreciate just how, in some sense, how complex religion is, or at least how many components are necessary for it to be practiced. And then also, that's what's so interesting is religion is utilizing so many or tapping into so many of these aspects of sociality and the just like that. Like, so, Jared was talking about the idea that, religion allows for a supernatural agent to sort of always be aware of your actions and enforcing the social norms of the group. It's like, well, my ancestors watching or God is watching, and so I need to, I should be moral. It gives you a reason to be moral beyond what you normally would be, or you might be.
Yeah. So quickly again, I want to talk about some prehistoric evidence of religion. So, for example, the earliest evidence of religious thought is based on the ritual treatment of the dead. So, ritual burial. So when you can clearly see that, some items have been placed in the grave, because, just burying the dead itself, you might argue is not an indication of, religious belief, because what if I just want to clean up the village or something, no, so that the dead people are not lying around, but if you see that clearly, like there has been some ritual related to um, the burial, that gives you an idea that it's very possible that people believed in the afterlife. And so ritual burials, and those again go back tens of thousands of years. So another one is use of symbolism from at least 100,000 years ago. There is evidence of the use of pigments such as red ochre. So they used it in various ways. And of course, there are all these cave paintings at, for example, at Chauvet, which is in France, depict creatures that are half human and half animal. So, like if you have a creature that is half human, half animal, you can say that this is not a depiction of the natural world. It's a symbol of some sort. And symbolic thinking is a prerequisite for emergence of, or an indication of emergence of religion. I don't know if you have comments for that.
No, it's fascinating, right? Like, so I think it's interesting.
Yeah. But so what I was going to say is that I think all of these pretty much, in my opinion, leave you basically with different scenarios. None of these evidences of gradual emergence and coincidence with human evolution, necessarily means that evolution. I mean, religion is something that just is a result of natural evolution. You might still say, well, God gave people religion when they were ready. I mean, that doesn't disprove, of course, evolution, but you could say, well, God let humans evolve, and then when humans were ready, then, God gave them religion. But I mean, then you could say that, well, these prerequisites and some of these behaviors are also present in the animal kingdom. You might say, well, this is just another feature of human evolution that emerged. And so that was the whole point of discussing the emergence of religion. But yeah, I mean, if I was to say a few more interesting things here that I read during preparation, I think that a concept that deserves some discussion is magical thinking, or superstitious thinking. And so magical thinking or superstitious thinking is the belief that unrelated events are causally connected despite the absence of any plausible causal link between them, and particularly as a result of supernatural effects. And examples include the idea that personal thoughts can influence the external world without acting on them, so on and so forth. Mm. And it calls magical thinking a type of fallacious thinking here. But so the reason I wanted to bring this out is that I think that we are predisposed to, superstitious thinking and magical thinking. And it says here that the precise definition of magical thinking may vary subtly when used by different theorists. In anthropology, the earliest research posited causalities between religious ritual, prayer, sacrifice, or the observance of a taboo, and an expected benefit of recompense. So, and it says here, of course, that later research indicates that magical thinking is also common in modern societies. So I think go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to kind of summarize it, it is kind of the idea of the pattern matching on steroids. And basically, we're looking for patterns and attachments to explain things. And our minds are very eager to find a pattern. And you can argue that's evolutionarily selected for, as if you can find a pattern, then great. And that can potentially save you or help you find resources or things like that. And usually the cost for mistaking a pattern isn't necessarily that high. And so, and so in magical thinking is, you make some association. You're like, well, I rubbed this on my, and you see this in athletics all the time, right? So like the superstitious thinking, it's like, well, I hit this locker before I went out and I played one of my best games, and so now I'm going to hit this locker every time. And so your mind is very eager to utilize any association that might be beneficial.
Yeah, and of course, the effect is very real, right? I mean, the person can have added peace or self-confidence or whatever, additional boost for performance. But the point is that it's all explicable by way of natural processes and a person's psychology. There's no actual magical or otherworldly I don't know effect or some tooth fairy or some angel or whatever is not actually, you're not tapping to their power or potential to help you, but it's just that this ritual is creating additional energy in your own mind. So basically what I'm saying is that it has an effect, but it's not the effect maybe that the person engaged in it thinks that it is.
Yeah, that's right. Like for these types of phenomena, you are imagining some sort of like actual causality, and that goes beyond what you're imagining in your mind. But sort of time and time again, with any sort of magical types of thinking, time and time again, when you subject them to rigorous investigation, they tend not to show up. They tend to, and really in every case, there's actually been lots and lots of prizes offered for demonstration of any type of supernatural kinds of abilities, or basically anything that we might classify as magical. And none of these prizes have ever been claimed. Nobody's ever sort of demonstrated under a rigorous setting that these things are actually happening. So like a good example is there was a science fair experiment. It was a young woman. Her mother was a nurse, so she was studying this at the time, but with touch healing. And the idea was that touch healers are able to, without physically touching a person, able to perceive energy fields, and then by manipulating the fields, they could heal the person. But this science fair experiment simply tests the idea that they could observe these energy fields. And so they had the person where they couldn't see their hands, and then she would put her hand above, just a few inches away from one or the other hand, and then the person who claimed to have touch healing abilities would, say which hand was near theirs. And basically, the demonstration was that no, they weren't able to detect energy fields under, sort of a robust scientific investigation. And so, but what's interesting also is that it didn't matter. So then those who it failed in, they invoked all kinds of other reasons for why it failed. So our models of the world are very robust, and we have a hard time. This is just everybody. Everybody has a hard time sort of reevaluating or giving up our models. We want those to persist, and so we'll invoke additional reasons. They were tired, or there was some reason why for each of these touch healers that couldn't actually detect the energy fields in actuality. There was a reason that they invoked in addition of why that happened. So they, to preserve the this magical worldview.
Mm. And this magical worldview also, I think we have to mention here, comes into play also in Mormonism, in the beginning of Mormonism. This is actually quite fascinating Mormon history. I was not aware of it until recently. Is that well, we all know now that in his youth, Joseph Smith was engaged in folk magic and in treasure digging, and it's something that you don't read from the church's official history books, but that there are documents out there, and Dan Vogel there's a really good Mormon Stories interview with Dan Vogel who talks about it at length. Is that when Joseph Smith was employed as a treasure digger by various people, he never actually found any. But so that Dan Vogel explains that is that like the same dynamic that you just talked about, that whenever they so Joseph Smith was the seer, or divinizer, who looked for the treasure and who could see where the treasures were buried, and then he would say, they would go to the hill or mound or whatever and say, the treasure is right here, but then they have to do some kind of a ritual, or I don't know what, I can't remember what the rituals or what the the necessary steps that had to be taken, but always there was so they did all these necessary steps, but they never found any treasure. And then Joseph Smith's explanations were always that that something was not correct in the ritual that they had done. Someone had said something lightly or out of context or whatever. They failed to do some other necessary action, and then the treasure would had slipped down the mountain, so it was no longer where it was supposed to be. So this is a lot of magical thinking, and also if you just kind of like apply your rational thoughts about like how a treasure buried tightly in a mountain could slip down, presumably as a reaction to someone misspeaking or something, you know, you can just say that, that's not That of course is not to disprove that Joseph Smith was not a was a prophet. I mean, you can still believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet. There's no question about that. But this just kind of shows how prevailing this kind of thinking was back then. So I'm just saying that it was an interesting idea, and based on Occam's razor, you could say that, well, was happening, that there was some magical misbehavior, or was it that there was no treasure there, and Joseph Smith was just trying to stay employed for another day? Just saying.
Yeah, that's right. The simplest explanation is there was no treasure in that particular case. And so all of this, if you want to read that incident is found in the Joseph Smith papers talking about the Josiah Stoll case of 1826. So you can kind of read the historical documentation on the Joseph Smith Papers project if you want to explore that more.
So. Sure. So, but one last thing I want to talk about regarding the emergence of religion is organizations' life cycles. And so this is now more about like organized religion in a modern sense, that when you study organizations, but also when you study religious organizations from history, you can sort of see that they all follow certain developmental steps. Like normally you have a charismatic founder who claims to speak for God or receive some kind of messages from God. Then you have early disciples, who are converted based on the charisma of the founder, and these early adopters have to be there in order for the group to survive, or the religion to survive. And normally these are people who then wholeheartedly believe and wholeheartedly commit to the mission, and they start evangelizing. And then, if all goes well, if the ideas take root, if they happen to be the right kind of, mix for the time and place, as in entrepreneurship, it's called the product market mix or match, product market match. And then it starts growing, and then as an organization starts growing, it becomes institutionalized. We will have official rules, dogmas, behaviors, rituals, that there's no longer this charismatic phase, but it's this more regulated phase in order for the organization to be able to grow. Because if there was no such tight control, then it would probably change and become a different thing, and there would no longer be the same organization. But then normally, then after time passes, there will be a decline, either a decline, or the organization will actually have to start constantly changing in order to stay up to date and stay relevant. So it was just something that I wanted to mention as a feature of religious organization that is easily explicable by sociology or group psychology, and something that can be universally observed, regardless of the doctrinal content of the organization.
Yeah, I just so I work in software development, and just seeing, for instance, software languages, software practices, almost all of them see this same type of trajectory where you'll have some sort of leader, sort of charismatic leader, and then you have some disciples who will say, "Hey, this is a great idea. let's do this. They'll evangelize it. Eventually, a foundation gets created to persist the idea and to sort of see the, continue growing the idea and making sure that it can survive changes and reach its full potential. And and then at some point it often, as really in competition with other new ideas or new languages or things, then an idea may decline in relevance as other, assuming if it hasn't been able to maintain relevance by changing to current needs and things like that. So yeah, it's a super, like, that life cycle is apparent in so many different ways and fields. And you're right that, like, you can view religion, the religious life cycle, in that way as well. And we have young religions growing up all the time, and, like, the Mormonism, we are both from that tradition, or we're both from that tradition, and so that was something that we have the ability to see it both, historically in its infancy with a charismatic leader in Joseph Smith, and then we can see its sometimes painful transition into a institution where and at this point is, you could argue, a well-oiled machine in terms of correlating material and in having sort of standardized approaches to things, handbooks that have been refined over a long period of time. And so yeah, and but then also because of some of that calcification, it's not as dynamic. And so some people who are seeking more dynamic engagement, say with the divine, that's not necessarily going to meet all of their needs. The stability might be, they may be more interested in exploration outside of those boundaries. And so now what we see is, and this has always been happening, but recently there's like the Denver Snuffer movement, and other like charismatic LDS movements that are branching off, who feel like the organization of the LDS Church is too restrictive, too stifling for their spiritual growth.
And I was going to just add that it's not unique to Mormonism. I mean, it's a universal, process that happens with all the religions. Christianity, Islam, all of them had a charismatic founder. All of them, I mean, Judaism, all of them believe that it started with, the message from God, the revelation from God about the truth and the true nature of things, and and of course, part of let's say maintaining and growing the organization are these sacred myths about and legends about how it all got started by way of divine intervention, and so that's why the founders are normally usually very revered. They are, because this is what it all started with. I mean, that's why uh, Christians literally believe that Jesus was divine, and that's why Muslims treat Muhammad as if he was divine, and basically that's why LDS people treat Joseph Smith as if he was divine. I mean, functionally they do, and so. So we observe it, but these are just three big religions. But I mean, this happens in all of the religions. So it's a very universal, process that we can observe. Okay, so I think this is enough for how religion emerges. Let's talk about how conversion happens. And I just wanted to here to just discuss a couple of concepts. And I think that the first one I want to talk about is egocentricity. And so this egocentricity, it maybe sounds bad, but it's not. I mean, it's very natural to think about that basically I view the world through my eyes, and I only know what it is like to be me. So in that sense, I'm like the center of the universe, and it's tempting to uh, view the world that things are happening for a reason, that God is making things happen in my life, and there is some bigger purpose to me than God is trying to communicate to me. And I think this kind of thinking, the egocentricity, is sort of a foundation for conversion, because you have, in order to be converted to something, you have to believe that, let's say that event A is pointing or inviting me towards religion X. That there is some, the reason that I met the missionaries on the street was a sign, or the reason that I saw the Jehovah's Witnesses Awake magazine, next to the trash bin or something, it was a sign for me to investigate the Jehovah's Witnesses, mm, or whatever it was. These and yeah, I mean, it's basically to this egocentricity is the approach that the universe or God is trying to tell me something, that something big is happening right now for me, and all I have to and I have to basically respond to this calling. I have to, as the LDS say, the exercise a particle of faith. And so this was very um, descriptive of my own conversion story, that there was a time when I was looking for meaning, and I was actively looking for meaning. I was actively looking for God tell me, or point me in some direction. And so, yeah, so I don't know if you want to have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, just to say that this is kind of the default mode, I think, for most parts of life, and often, like for instance, career choices kind of fall in this category where you're like, well, what am I called to do? What are my skills? And what's the meaning of it all? And so I think that this is kind of just a very human thing to do, and religion is maybe it's a little bit better than some other institutions or cultural institutions at kind of co-opting. It's really that search for meaning and purpose. They have such a strong sense of meaning and purpose that it's not very difficult to attach, to want to attach onto something like that.
Yeah. I think the threat is that it can delve into this magical or superstitious thinking that, some random events happening in my life point me somewhere. For example, like the easiest one is to base big life decisions on a random, scripture you picked flipping through the scriptures. Like you have to marry I don't know, don't marry an infidel, or I don't know, serve a mission. Like these huge big life decisions are based on sort of, you put your confidence or trust in some random events.
Yeah. On that note, this is kind of related to that, but it has to do also with just the pattern finding and pattern making. And so as a scientist, I love control experiments, because the kind of control experiment lets you know what the default state is without any other variables involved. And so Darren Brown performed, this is kind of an informal experiment, but I think this type of thing has been shown in other psychological experiments. Is he did an experiment where he took a subject and he said, okay, we are going to intervene in your life in significant ways over the next, I think it was 2 weeks or a month. And don't look for us. We have trained actors. We're going to have some, hidden cameras and things like this. And we're going to be, just, doing intervening in your life, right? To help you observe and potentially make changes or things like this. This was the preamble, and he did one demonstration with her there to show how he could cause actors to manipulate events. And then he said, okay, the experiment was off. And the experiment, basically, he did nothing. He didn't intervene in her life in any way whatsoever. And then over the course of, the several weeks or a month, she recorded all of the ways in which she interpreted events as having meaning and intervention in her life. And it was things like, this person was smiling at me in a certain way, and that made me realize, well, maybe I should smile a little bit more, and maybe I should take more joy in life, or whatever it was. But what was so fascinating, it was that, again, there was no actual purposeful intervention specifically, and we can say that he didn't intervene whatsoever, and yet she interpreted so many when she was looking for that. Then she interpreted so many events as things that really reflected back onto her. And the fascinating part of this, I think, is that when the experiment was over and she realized, like, so Darren said, well, we didn't do anything, we didn't intervene at all. And what was so interesting is that it didn't negate her reflective experience of things that she wanted to do better in, or change in her own life. And that was the part that the meaning making kind of has purpose outside of whether it was actually somebody doing the intervention. And so that's the fascinating part, is that there's still meaning regardless of whether something is intervening. It's, looking for purpose can be interesting, or can be helpful in having us grow, is kind of the idea. So.
Okay. Another topic that I want to talk about, that will be a little bit sensitive, I think, but still, just because for me, the egocentric Kenneth is talking about this now, but the emotion of elevation, I will just quote that elevation is an emotion elicited by witnessing virtuous acts of remarkable moral goodness. It is experienced as a distinct feeling of warmth and expansion that is accompanied by appreciation and affection for the individual whose exceptional conduct is being observed. Elevation motivates those who experience it to open up, to affiliate with, and assist others. Elevation makes an individual feel lifted up and optimistic about humanity. End of the quote. This was from the Wikipedia article on elevation emotion. So, I mean, does this sound familiar to an LDS person? Is this a concept that we're used to hearing? So I think, so this does sound a lot like what in the LDS church they talk about, feeling the Spirit, or the Spirit testifying, right? And so, yeah, I guess, again, to understand that these emotions and these, I mean, they are emotions, these emotions that we feel when we, witness something, let's say, sacred or goodness or virtuous, the natural response is to have this pleasing feeling of elevation, or emotion of elevation. And I mean, I experience it sometimes when I watch a good movie or listen to good music, or when I've felt it whenever you feel these goosebumps or whatever. I felt it watching sports, for example. Some last minute play or something that saved the team or whatever. These special feelings. And I've always thought about, well, why do I feel the same way as when I get when God testifies me of the truth? Like, why do I feel the same way about, like, watching a mixed martial arts fight or something? It feels kind of what's counterintuitive, or like difficult to explain. But then, once you come across the concept of the emotion of elevation, I think it just kind of helps understand how it's not necessarily it's not necessarily God testifying to you about the veracity of some dogma, of some religious dogma, but it can be purely a conditioned emotion. You have any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that religion is so. Yeah, the elevation emotion is something that scientists are really just beginning to formalize, to formally study. And so there's probably a lot to be said. Some of the things that they've been able to discover so far are things. It's thought that physiologically that oxytocin, which is kind of a bonding hormone, it has lots of hormones tend to be multivalent, so there's not just one effect usually, but there's usually a related effect. But for instance, spiritual experiences are modulated by different alleles, different variations in your oxytocin receptor. And so this has been demonstrated as sort of the intensity, the types of spiritual experience a person has is related to their genetic predisposition. And then the other thing is thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective is that when we see altruistic acts, or when those give us a response, then that makes us also want to do things that are altruistic and also to receive that reward. So because we can generate those acts, we can go do something kind for a stranger, we can go help somebody in our family who's in need, and then we have and then the presumably we have this emotion. And emotion is a little bit is maybe not the exact best word, because we think about that as to some extent being a transcendent emotion. Like, it's not just feeling happy or sad. Sometimes it goes beyond that. And but yeah, so anyway, that emotion is, but we still call emotion sort of the best word that we have to describe it. But it's a very powerful hormonal type of potentially response from a scientific perspective. But it encourages us to engage in group behavior, where we're taking a concern for the group, so caring for others and things like that. And so there's a great benefit for that. And yeah, so I think the big sort of debate from a religious perspective is, do these feelings indicate that my particular group is is in possession of the correct theology? And that, I think, is debatable at very least.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. So one more thing I wanted to talk about regarding how conversion happens is that when a person is converted, then there is someone who converts. It's some people that convert. There's activity in the religion converts, and in fact, John, you have been an LDS missionary, and so have I. I think that when I became a missionary, I was actually quite surprised at how, let's say, systematic a process it was, and definitely a lot of managerial experience and wisdom, and things were employed to the process. And I think that you can compare missionary work to a sales process. For example, there are door-to-door salesmen. There is this multi-level marketing sales process. It gets people to uh, commit to do certain things in order to how should I say, to become more involved, let's say, and then eventually you you are expected to publicly profess your faith, because when we profess something publicly, we become more committed to it. And this is again regardless of the contents, or the, like, whether we can actually verify the veracity of the content, whether it's actually true, whether it's actually factual, but just the process of professing to believe or know something, it makes us more, it makes us believe it more. And 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 uh, and then rituals, like for example, rituals are part of committing to a new religion that you convert to, because they create this special occasion. You feel, and in the future you think back fondly at the day I was baptized or whatever. Like you create this mm, mental attachment, or is this like some fond memory that is sacred to you, and you want it to be a part of your life, and the commitments you made are important. This goes for marriage, this goes for baptisms, things like this. And yeah.
Yeah, so just yeah, a couple points, and this is, one thing is that, yeah, as you pointed out, these patterns to some extent are involved in all kinds of institutions, and I think that's just worth emphasizing over and over, is that a lot of these things are not necessarily unique to to religion. It's part of culture. It's the way, and some of these were explicitly co-opted from sort of business paradigms and things like that. So there are definitely psychologists who participated in the LDS, missionary framework. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that for most of religion is transmitted familially. It's by family. Conversion is kind of to some extent the exception. Of course, a religion that's able to convert people to its cause is then naturally going to persist better than a religion that does not convert. But the major difference between Mormonism and Shakerism is that Mormons or Latter-day Saints, as they prefer to be called now, tend to have very large families, whereas Shakers tended to be celibate. And as a result, there's a handful of Shakers in the world today, and between maybe 5 million active Latter-day Saints and 15 or 16 million on the rolls. And so, and then the other thing that's interesting about I think the missionary experience is that one argument is that the missionary experience is far more about converting the missionary than it is in actually even gaining converts. And the way that this we can think about this happening is that by going out and sort of being sharing the message in the way that we do, it's a way that most of the time we're met with rejection, and that feeling of rejection, where we go out and we share our beliefs very vulnerably, it ends up entrenching us more within our group, because when we come back from a missionary service, we're like, oh, here it's only within my religious group that I'm truly understood, that my religious beliefs are really respected. Whereas when I go out and try and share this with every single person on the street, I'm met with skepticism and ridicule and and things like that. And so in some sense, you can argue that the missionary experience has sort of been designed or evolved or accidentally, whatever, but it's very effective at producing completing a conversion experience of those who even were born into the faith. It allows them to entrench more into that particular worldview or religion.
Yeah, I think two comments about that. First is that later we'll talk about the backfire effect, and what you just described is the backfire effect, where criticism and adversity actually it strengthens your commitment to what has been criticized. And the other is that I think that because these in many areas of the world, missionary work is challenging, and these Therefore, any success you have and any big success you have as a missionary, it sort of then amplifies, this effect of success, and you feel like, well, this is truly a miracle, like God really had his hand in it, and so it's basically, of course, I've had the same thing, like I served in a place where mm, let's say the harvest was meager, and it happened only every so often. But at some point, I just started to kind of realize that there are there are concrete statistical uh, correlations between, like, let's say I get one baptism. In order to get one baptism, I have to teach 200 lessons. In order to get 200 lessons, I have to talk to 5,000 people. And so, like, like, eventually when I talk to 5,000 people, it's going to happen, like, so so you could say that, yes, well, it's the experience itself is maybe um, uh, is miraculous, but when you look at from like, let's say, you take a statistical approach, is that, for every 5,000 people I get to contact, at least one person who will end up going through the entire process of converting. So again, it's and that way you can say that, uh, again, no divine intervention was really needed, for this person to convert, but it was just a matter of statistics playing itself out, and
The
that's all.
other Yeah, the other aspect of conversion that shouldn't be overlooked is just the social element. And it's well recognized the study of religion that, the more people in your peer group, the more of your friends who are of a particular belief, the more likely it is that you will have that belief. And a large part of the missionary effort is to help a person become friends with, and find sociality and to just start those activities, go to church, go to the activities, do the things, create, bring over members who then become friends with the person. And that's usually most effective when they don't already have robust friend groups or whatever. They're seeking additional sociality. And one of the things that you observe is that, the missionaries who were best able to create good social networks tended to have the most success. And so I just remember there was a fellow, he was a ward mission leader in Scotland, but he basically he didn't follow any of the mission rules, which we would have expected would have disqualified him from being successful as a missionary. But what he did is he hung out with all of his investigators, he hung out with all of his new converts, and they did all sorts of non-mission approved types of activities. But what he was doing was creating like this sociality, and it turns out, humans are very social, and he had like tremendous success. One of the highest baptizing missionaries apparently, in his mission in England. And whereas, so a lot of us, like, I tried to do everything sort of by the book or this type of thing, we didn't necessarily emphasize the social elements as much, and so and correspondingly we were met with less success than at least he was, when he just very much emphasized the social aspect of religion. And this is the overarching framework for studying why people kind of do these types of things, and for studying conversion or deconversion or things, is social learning. And that's the idea that they in our peers, we're constantly in explicit and implicit ways emphasizing different rewards and punishments for different types of behavior. And so if our peer group punishes us or punishes us for not going to church, or rewards us for going to church, then those are, and there's millions of these cues, these minor cues, many of which are imperceptible, but of getting confirmation and feedback, positive and negative feedback from our peer group that we care about. That's a big part of enforcing the like kind of religious ritual and habits and sociality.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think we should probably now tackle our last big topic, is how faith is maintained. And here again, I think there are some concepts that I think we should go over. Yeah, so I think let's start with confirmation bias. So I'll read from Wikipedia. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs or values. People display this bias when they select information that supports their views, ignoring contrary information, or when they interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their existing attitudes. The effect is strongest for desired outcomes, for emotionally charged issues, and for deeply entrenched beliefs. Confirmation bias cannot be eliminated entirely, but it can be managed, for example, by education and training in critical thinking skills. So, John, have you experienced confirmation bias in your life?
Well, yeah, sure. I think so this is a very human thing that we all do, and I think that's what I would say is it's the exception. As it pointed out, it's the exception, not the rule, that we are able to overcome the confirmation bias. And that's just the way I think we form models in our mind. We tend to look for confirmation first before we look to invalidate them. And then the more a model is central to our identity and safety and health and that type of thing, the more protective we are of that particular model, and the less interested we are in subjecting it to rigorous scrutiny. Like that, just, and so, yeah, so I guess that's the main thing, is that it's just a human thing, and that this only happens in certain select cases because the institutions are created in like the scientific enterprise is sort of special in this way, because there's a reward given for scrutinizing, for toppling, for falsifying your framework, but doing so, you're not kicked out of the community. You're given a reward for being able to do that. So, like, if a scientist can find a way to falsify their theory, then they're rewarded for doing that. But that's such a rare thing. In most culture, in most society, you are not given any rewards for poking holes in the dominant paradigm. But that's starting to happen secularly, where, for instance, we have had to create special laws to protect whistleblowers. As an example, the people who are wanting to poke holes in a particular system or say, hey, there's a problem here, we have to make special allowances to even to allow that or to encourage it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, the next one is very related, and then I will definitely want to discuss more about that. It's called groupthink. And I will read again. Groupthink is a psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome. Cohesiveness, or the desire for cohesiveness in a group, may produce a tendency among its members to agree at all costs. This causes the group to minimize conflict and reach a consensus decision without critical evaluation. Groupthink is a construct of social psychology, but has an extensive reach and influences literature in the fields of communication studies, political science, management, and organizational theory, as well as important aspects of deviant religious cult behavior. End of quote. So I think that, it doesn't have to be deviant religious cult behavior. It's very common to go along with groupthink. yeah, I think that it's basically, confirmation bias is a tool employed by groupthink, because we always want the group only wants to hear the news that basically confirms its correctness, and so I think that it's very problematic, and very often these organizational arrangements, they sort of they try to block criticism, or like you have to sort of intentionally invite criticism in order to get it, because, like, for example, many successful business organizations or companies that have been studied, it has been shown, or that's what the people who study, the scientists who study them, say that one of the reasons why they are continually successful is because they invite input and criticism and normalize criticism, so that everyone is comfortable giving their actual honest thoughts about what they observe, and they invite open ideas, they invite criticism, which is often not the norm, especially in dogmatic religions.
Yeah, and I think I see groupthink as there's a cost and benefit to group coherence and working together, and then there's also a cost and a benefit to your fidelity to the objective world, and those two are in some tension some of the time. A group that can't unify and come together on a consensus and do something under, let's say, under a survival situation, that group is likely to perish, right? It won't even persist. And obviously, at the same time, if a group is so, if they center on ideas that are so far removed from objective reality, then they're going to have a hard time also surviving, because they can't they can't actually function in ways that are meaningful. And so there's some tension between those. In some sense, criticism is sort of a luxury of having of not being in a heightened safety type situation where there are enough resources, there's enough time. And so societies often, like, that's in some sense, like the university is an expression of extra resources and some sort of stability, where we say, hey, you guys can just criticize and focus and think about all the ways that we're doing things wrong, and maybe we'll feed back some of these these ideas. But in some sense, the ability to really criticize your own group is kind of a luxury. And so that's the point I'm making, is that under certain situations, groupthink is sort of maybe a great survival mechanism, and it's very important. And then in other situations, then it can become very stifling, and it can lead a group away from objective reality, and so it can become very kind of damaging and suboptimal. And so, but there's just this constant balance between those concerns.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Context does that determine the let's say the how beneficial something is, for sure. So again, another thing that I think is worth mentioning from my own experience also is that I didn't have the expression for it, but later I found the expression for it. It's called thought stopping or think stopping, and so the idea of thought stopping is that you know probably related to confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. But so I just wanted to say that is that often we are able to kind of like predict or feel that certain inquiry or certain trains of thought or progressions of thought will probably lead us to results that are at odds with our current beliefs. And so we consciously kind of dismiss those thoughts. We stop them. We say, okay, I'm not going to go there, because if I go there, then who knows what's going to happen. I think it's a very common mental technique among dogmatic believers. And I think I also see that it's also kind of promoted by highly dogmatic organizations. The expressions like doubts are from the devil and such. Always remember what you felt, or things like these, is that basically don't study in depth, or don't study from certain angles or from certain perspectives, because think of what you might lose. So
Yeah,
it's this kind of a
just a few more examples. Don't rehearse your doubts with doubters, so that you don't have a chance to really express or formulate or articulate those things. This was recently expressed in an LDS meeting. And then one that I'm familiar with, Joseph F. Smith talked about, and this was in a recent manual, LDS manual, was that those who disagree with the LDS doctrine are really only two types of people. They're either proud or they're ignorant. And so that's it. So if you have a disagreement, if you think you understand the topic really well, well, then now you've pitted your understanding against the leadership. So you're just too proud. So that's your problem. And then if you haven't studied it in depth, but you still think there's a problem, then you're just ignorant. Like, why do you think you have a leg to stand on if you haven't studied this comprehensively? And so, but what's so interesting about all of these types of thinking, so I classify I think about these as what I term as hermetically sealed systems of thought. So a hermetic seal is like an airtight seal, and you can't, once you're within that way of thinking, there actually is no solution that lets you depart from that way of thinking. And so, like in that example, there's essentially no way to disagree with LDS doctrine without being one of those two things. If you know a lot, you're proud. If you don't know a lot, then you are ignorant. And so it's in those, and you don't realize that, like, so there's just no way. So your focus is on, am I proud or am I ignorant? But the reality is that you never even necessarily stop to think, well, maybe I should or could be able to validly disagree with like an LDS doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a few more that under this how is faith maintained that I want to discuss. So I think we have to talk about cognitive dissonance. Again, something that I discovered some years ago that I hadn't thought about before. So in Wikipedia, it talks about it this way. Cognitive dissonance. In the field of psychology, cognitive dissonance is the perception of contradictory information. Relevant items of information include a person's actions, feelings, ideas, beliefs, and values, and things in the environment. Cognitive dissonance is typically experienced as psychological stress when they participate in an action that goes against one or more of them. According to this theory, when two actions or ideas are not psychologically consistent with each other, people do all in their power to change them until they become consistent. The discomfort is triggered by the person's belief clashing with new information perceived, wherein they try to find a way to resolve the contradiction to reduce their discomfort. Coping with the nuances of contradictory ideas or experiences is mentally stressful. It requires energy and effort to sit with those seemingly opposite things that all seem true. Festinger argued that some people would inevitably resolve dissonance by blindly believing whatever they wanted to believe. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, just a lot of the concepts we've been discussing have to do with the resolution of cognitive dissonance. So the idea, like when we profess a belief, even if we don't fully believe it, so they've shown this in psychological experiments. If we didn't have, as soon as we profess that we believe something, then our mind works to get to a point where we can say that we actually do believe it. And so our mind wants there to be resonance and harmony, and then socially speaking, we want to be thought of as a person of integrity, which means that we're consistent between our behavior. And so I think that's one of the things that, say, high demand religions do, is they typically require actions of very public professions of faith, bearing testimony in public, doing missionary work, writing your testimony in a Book of Mormon and handing it to somebody else, things like the very public professions. And so what that does psychologically, at least, if we can extrapolate from the experiments, is that your mind then is like, no, I believe this, I'm all in, because we want to minimize the dissonance between our beliefs and our behaviors as well. So.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
No, you're fine.
Yeah. So there's a few more that I want to touch that just I have observed in my own life that are important factors in maintaining faith. One that I think want to bring out is that our roles affect our thinking, including about religion and incentives. For example, a leader, especially in the church, but also in the family or at work, is incentivized by reputation and the contribution they have provided to be loyal to the organization, because contribution is a sunk cost, meaning that you have put in a lot of effort or you've contributed a lot, and this is sunk cost fallacy, is something that has been mm, uh, uh, talked about in the literature, that people tend to evaluate projects that they have personally contributed to as more valuable than a bystander, let's say a neutral bystander views them. It comes to, let's say, for example, selling your business. Like if you put in 20 years to build up your business, then you assign it a higher valuation than someone would be willing to pay for it just based on the economics of the business, for example. And also monetary rewards compound the incentive to be loyal. Again, something that we don't always think about on a daily basis, or Latter-day Saints don't think about, but the general authorities, they are monetarily incentivized. They have, pledged their whole career to the church, and they are, again, it depends on your perspective, like whether you consider those incentives, big or small. But from what has been leaked by whistleblowers, for example, is that I think some 5 or 7 years ago, a general authority, and I think from what I understand, they sort of standardized their allowances, that their annual living allowance was $120,000, and there is talk of other incentives there too, for like let's say loan forgiveness of up to, it's not loan forgiveness, but it's more like assuming loan obligations for up to $1 million, for a general authority that is called. So I know that for someone in the United States that is a like a well-paid professional or doctor or something, this doesn't actually sound like a big amount of money, but for someone who is in there, I don't know, maybe let's say like apostles or general authorities are sometimes educators or someone that 120,000 is actually quite a lot of money, and they would not be very employable outside of the church context. So it can be a big incentive. So again, I just wanted to say that the roles we have and the incentives we have in place, this can be monetary incentive, reputation incentive, or provided contribution. They can be big incentives for us to stay loyal to a certain faith tradition or faith organization. So I don't know if you have comments about that.
I think you've covered the basis of it. I think in talking about like the monetary remuneration for leadership, LDS leadership, it's definitely, I think it definitely has to be a factor. I know, speaking personally, so I was an employee, I was a professor at BYU, and even though, I was reading and discovering a lot and of claims that might influence my faith while I was a BYU employee, my paycheck was dependent on having a current temple recommend and things like that. And my understanding at the time was that I had to essentially I had to believe completely in order to get a temple recommend, and that otherwise I would lose my job. And that type of thing. So it's not explicit, but in the back of your mind, I think you're very just wary of exploring alternative hypotheses and the idea that you might be wrong because your survival and safety as you see it is dependent on those things. And I think LDS leadership, those same things are probably in play, where their pensions, all of they have so many arrangements where their children and grandchildren have huge bonus or stipends around education. They're able to do church schools for very cheap, and so there's all kinds of different perks and incentives that make it very dangerous to explore other types of thinking. And then at the same time, so an LDS leader gets so much they're held up as such an example, and they're given so much adulation that I think it'd be very difficult for most people to walk away from that and then, and disappoint all these people who have been, looking to them as a spiritual leader. And so I think that's part of the, maybe part of the explanation for why LDS leadership is essentially, you don't see a lot of defection from LDS leadership. There was definitely more in the early church, but in part, we might say that the reason it doesn't happen as much now is because there's so many other factors that feed into creating that loyalty. And loyalty is one of the, so Jonathan Haidt, with moral foundations theory, identified 5 or 6 fundamental moral impulses that we have, and loyalty and authority are 2 of the strongest kind of moral impulses that we have. And so that's just it factors into our beliefs strongly, in every direction, in every system. So it's not just religion. Again, it's in all the ways it means to be human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that again, something from my own experience is that especially like the financial incentives, they become more important, when you start a family, like you have a, and especially the larger the family grows, the more stability you need, the less you can afford to disrupt, your family's financial stability. And also, as you age, um, your your energy starts to reduce a little bit, and there are certain careers that sort of run their course by age 50 or 55, where your ability to earn is decreased, and then the ability to concentrate, let's say, on church service, and get paid for it is, I think, is a very good incentive, very strong incentive, because many LDS people are used to contributing a lot of their time and energy and of themselves to the church anyway, and enjoy it. Basically, it's a very fulfilling way to spend time. And if you have an option between, let's say, I don't know, earning $60,000 a year, or 70 or $80,000 a year in a decent career, but you can up that to 120 or whatever $1,000 a year it is now. I think it's definitely a strong incentive that, and that does not mean that I somehow blame these people for doing it for money. No, I'm just as incentivized by money to do what I do, and it would be very hard for me to walk away from my job, because I am well compensated, and that's why maybe I understand the strength of the incentive. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, I think it's important to emphasize that, like most of these types of um, conversations, I would say, or even understanding or motivations, these are subliminal or subconscious. I don't think any leader has ever sat down and said, "Well, I'm not going to really question my faith deeply because I'm getting this paycheck," right? Like that conversation never happens, in those terms. But there's definitely some of these, deeper subconscious things that influence all humans, and I think it's fair to point them out, that the incentives align in those ways, and humans are known to be subject to those types of influences.
Yeah, sure. A few more, John. I hope you can. I hope you're still still have the energy and time to do it. So just a few more that I think that are important to how faithful a person is to an organization, a religious organization. And I think one thing is mm, basically how much value and trust they place on external authorities of truth, or of information. Uh, there is a difference in the degree to which people trust external authorities to tell them the truth or facts, including in religious things. And uh, for example, mm, something that I have noticed myself is that when in puberty, you sort of want to rebel against authority figures, your parents, for example, uh, and you place a lot of authority in your friends, for example. But then by early adulthood, especially your mission and after your mission, it sort of reverses, and you're like you kind of want to be the grown up, and you want to be with the program, get with the program, and you have all these goals that are intertwined with your religion, like you want to get married and 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 stuff like that, and have children, and bring up a family in the religion. And uh, and as I've noticed, like these sorts of things, they tend to decrease towards midlife, because the more self-confident you become due to, I mean, this can coincide with your professional success, for example. is that you begin to understand, and you gain more just life experience, more wisdom, more information, and so like when in my 20s, like I really um, was very trusting of what an 80-year-old general authority would say, because I thought, they have 4 times the amount of experience that I do. Of course, they would know better than, when you're 35, 40, or maybe even 30, you have had some experience, you've studied topics in depth. Maybe you've been a leader in the church, you've seen, things play out, or 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 these kinds of things may then reduce your dependence on external authorities, and you maybe place a higher value on authenticity, to being your own master, to live your life. um, you want to be, let's say, you're more uh, uh, you have more sort of self-confidence and courage to um, mm, distance yourself from a group that you used to belong to, or something like that. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great description of sort of the ebb and flow of, or the dynamic of deference to external authority. This might be a good point to talk about the attachment theory of religion, because I think this is
Sure.
super fascinating. I was just in a conversation. It was my neighbors' in-laws were over, so Brent and Tanya Perkins brought this up, and so I've been studying this recently in the academic literature, and it's a main theory for religion, and it's a kind of a scaffold for understanding, and it kind of, to some extent, it makes the case, or it helps define the case for why humans are so religious. And the basic idea is that we have very primal impulses to look for or towards a caregiver. And so if you think about a baby, when it's has needs, it needs to be in proximity to a caregiver to help them with those needs. They're helpless otherwise. And so that programming is, to some extent, recapitulated in religion, where a religion, so from a godlike figure, can act like a caregiver and can act like an authority figure or things like that. So both a parental and an authority type figure. And you could argue also that religious leaders can act like sort of surrogate caregivers, where if you know that there's this a sort of authority figure, or this person that will help you if you're in need and can give you guidance and direction, then you have an attachment to them. And there's kind of two competing theories. One has to do with correspondence. It's the idea that if you had good, strong attachments with your caregiver growing up, then those continue on, and you continue to resonate with those ways of thinking, and they may be with God or your religious institution. And then the other is a compensation type mechanism. So if you didn't have good attachment, then perhaps a godlike figure or religious authority figures then become your caregiving type of figure. And so anyway, that's an ongoing theory in psychology, and I think it's just a super interesting way to think about religion. And so so in some sense, from that framework, how do people maintain religious belief? And the idea is, well, they don't have to do anything to maintain religious belief, or say belief in God, because it's sort of hardwired in. They're just resonating with these natural primal instincts to seek a caregiver. And you pointed to the idea of well, when your safety, when your financial security is improved, then it sort of offers you the ability, the opening, so to speak, to well, maybe I can, maybe I don't need this caregiver as much. And that's also, so there's these two toggles. One is safety, and the other is exploration. And they've shown this in terms of in caregiver and the dependency relationship, that you are sort of always in flux between the safety mode and like, hey, where's my caregiver, and then exploration mode. And so definitely as you become more secure in life, I think, you know, it sort of dials up. Well, your ability to explore is increased. And I think that this is also why I think it's important not to judge other people in their religious journey. And that's because the idea is like, well, look, well, maybe you were at a point of security where you were able to explore this. And so then you were able to make that choice. A lot of people have just never hit that point of, say, security. And so they've just mentally or whatever have never been able to explore that. And so never had the opportunity. And so all I'm saying, or it never made sense to abandon the safety. Even maybe they were able to explore some, but maybe it's not a compelling proposition. And again, most of these things aren't rational thought. Most of these things are kind of sub-rational arguments that happen oftentimes subconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that perhaps we'll do one last one so that the audience will have one more term in their portfolio now. So, and I want to conclude that the backfire effect and belief perseverance. So these are two related terms. And so I will just quote again from Wikipedia. Belief perseverance, also known as conceptual conservatism, is maintaining a belief despite new information that firmly contradicts it. Such beliefs may even be strengthened when others attempt to present evidence debunking them, a phenomenon known as the backfire effect. For example, in The Atlantic, journalist Carrie Rom describes a study involving vaccination hesitancy. Okay, so this is very timely. In the study, the subjects were concerned of the side effects of flu shots and became less willing to receive them after being told that the vaccination was entirely safe. Okay, so there are three kinds of backfire effects. Familiarity backfire effect, from making myths more familiar. Overkill backfire effect, from providing too many arguments. And worldview backfire effect, from providing evidence that threatens someone's worldview. Physicist Max Planck wrote that the new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Peter Morris suggests that the process of abandoning a conviction is similar to the working out of grief. The impulse to defend the predictability of life is a fundamental and universal principle of human psychology. Human beings possess a deep-rooted and insistent need for continuity. That was the end of the quote. So if your information threatens deep-rooted worldviews, it's more likely going to strengthen the worldview and not to make someone question, which is actually sort of counterintuitive, because I think that I can honestly say that any faith transitions that I have had, or you know, change of mind has become from rational arguments, but maybe also that I was open and willing and ready to change. Yeah, I think so. Actually, the latter one was also very important, because I have been uh, uh, I'm starting to forget English. Exposed to critical information, you know, for almost 20 years or more about the LDS Church, and you know, only in the last couple of years I've really, let's say, taken it seriously and gave it serious consideration. So I think it does matter, like your frame of mind, your attitude does matter in how you respond.
Yeah, one of the famous studies that is probably worth bringing up. I mean, you quoted Festinger, and they did embedded anthropological work where they went in with a doomsday cult and were members, essentially members of the cult, to understand the phenomena. And there was a predicted time when the world was meant to end, and they're following this and just observing all of it. And what ended up happening is, of course, the world, this was in the late 50s, I think, and the world didn't end. And what you then observed is that everybody who was very committed to the faith, their adherence to the religious, principles of that group increased. So you definitely had some fallout. So people who weren't quite as committed, like that's a deal breaker. It's like we said that the world was going to end. Here we are. This is a problem. We're not cohering with objective reality very well. But those who were very committed just reformulated, and that's what kind of reformulated the model, tweak it a little bit, and they continued on, and they actually were more resolved, more committed, even though they had you could argue, a direct piece of fundamental contradictory evidence to their model. But because they were so committed to it, they merely reinterpreted their model. They tweaked it slightly. There was an initial phase where everybody was kind of hesitant, like what's going on, and somebody eventually offers, well, maybe this, maybe this, maybe this, and they were able to add a few extra assumptions and tweak the model and kind of carry on. And humans, I mean, we tend to do that. So you were mentioning belief perseverance. We do that normally, and because that's our models are so valuable to us, and the way we tend to create models is through tweaking them and adjusting them as new information comes along. And so it's very difficult for anyone to sort of reconsider and overturn a fundamental working model of how the world works. But yeah, so it's I think it's a fascinating phenomena. We're all subject to it. But it's definitely relevant to religion. But this is also, I think, something to be aware of for anyone. Is politically, economic theories are like this. There's so many ways in which we all are subject to this behavior where we are really looking to confirm our own beliefs, and it's very rare that we're willing to subject them to potential, genuine falsification. And so, yeah, I'd just say, speaking generally, is these are very educational for anybody. And if adhering to objective reality is important to a person, then you'll try to recognize. I think a person will. And you're in a space where you have enough safety and security to engage in such an exercise, then I think it's worth appreciating these biases that we have and trying to overcome them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we've had a pretty good discussion, John. It's been over 2 hours, almost 2 hours and 13 minutes. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered a lot of different concepts, and that was the idea, to have sort of a broad overview of these topics of psychology and sociology, group psychology, that influence or have that have some connection and influence to religion, religious minds, spirituality. I think it will be important. I think it is important, and I think it's also very uh, beneficial for people who are religious and who are not religious to understand these phenomena, because I think that the more we understand these things, the more we can also understand each other, the more we can understand each other's choices, the more maybe tolerant we can be of each other's choices. And yeah, so I see. So even though it may be sounded critical of religion, I think that all of these can be interpreted um, in a way that does not harm a person's faith or belief system if it's important to them, and if they want to maintain it and consider it of value. But just from my personal experience, because we have been discussing science and religion, I think it was an important aspect and point of connection between science and religion that needed to be covered. And so thank you, John, for participating. Any last words you want to leave?
I think that was a great summary. It was a pleasure. I think it's great to, regardless of a person's religious persuasion and beliefs. I mean, I think it's great to consider all the different ideas and research and study, the psychology of religion and the evolution of religion. It's great to appreciate those and understand those. And like you say, I think that I just want to emphasize, your point is that this type of information, it can be viewed as critical of religion, but I think your point is that it can also be used to understand religion and to increase sort of sympathy and empathy and understanding for different points of view and how we all end up where we're at and believing what we do. And it's a messy, like, understanding the world and coming to terms with it and working together for safety and security and peace. And it's a challenging enterprise. And so but yeah, it's great to talk through all these things. It was really fun.
Thank you very much. Until next time.
Okay.